when you go on a vacation to a tropical country and you have to take a shot, it's not very fun, but it's something that everyone is expected to do, both for their personal safety as well as other people. But only if they're white! In this video, I'll demonstrate how little Sweden cares about public health policy and citizen safety. And do emphasize the word citizen there, because this is a huge problem for all of us, regardless of skin tone. And I know it's funny I say this, given our global image as the place that cares about people's health, but unlike America, it's not mandatory for migrants to go through a health check and take necessary shots to prevent epidemics. So it's no surprise that there was an outbreak of measles in Stockholm in 2017, since some Somalis believe that vaccines will give their children autism. What's interesting is that 70% of the immigrants in the ghettos where the outbreak originated from did vaccinate themselves. So you only really need a few who don't to mess it up for everyone else. Consider the fact that Swedish newborns don't get vaccinated right away, and you realize that there's different kinds of Swedish citizens as well that could be affected by this. Sweden recently got in the global spotlight over a potential Ebola patient, a Swede who had been traveling in Africa. And it turns out that he didn't have Ebola, he just shit and vomited blood. We've all been there, bro. But here's the thing. What if it actually had been Ebola? That scare that people eventually debunked, dismissed, and forgot about is actually 100% possible, since Sweden doesn't have mandatory health checks for immigrants. We don't even have it with Swedish citizens who for some reason want to have their vacation in disease-ridden countries. So this is an all-around bad system, okay? It should be both in and out. In and out. In the past decades, Sweden has carried out a migration policy where you put as low standards as possible on those who migrate. This racism of low expectations policy not only fuels polarization, it's a disaster waiting to happen in more ways than one. Unless we can stop being so ridiculously neurotic. It's kind of been a taboo to even want to talk basic medical science. Tuberculosis was officially declared eradicated here in Sweden in the 80s. But now it's back, and 90% of those with the disease are foreign and have arrived in Sweden the past years, aka refugee crisis. Thanks to migration, there's also been a heavy increase of MRSA, which basically means antibiotic-resistant staphylococcus, and especially tricky superbugs, since traditional antibiotics don't work on it. So people have to use other, more obscure kinds that give worse side effects and are way more expensive. Now, MRSA work like regular staphylococcus, so it's not exactly deadly per se. It's more the fact that it's harder to treat, so it has time to develop into something worse before you find the right antibiotics. It doesn't work like a disease, say cholera or Ebola. MRSA make things more complicated. They don't technically infect people. It's something that you carry around until you get unwell or hurt yourself, at which point things get way more complicated. Some of you may know of flesh-eating disease, otherwise you can just Google it and click images. Pause this video right now though and make yourself a nice juicy sandwich first, because it's quite the colorful experience. MRSA is involved in a third of those cases. Now, flesh-eating disease is rare, but what happens when MRSA no longer isn't? See why everyone has an incentive to care about hygiene, even if something isn't obviously dangerous on the surface? Right now, however, it's mostly a problem for hospitals. Something gets harder to treat, it starts eating up more resources. More time at the hospital, diagnostics, medicine, staff, all of that translates into a much higher cost for society than what's actually necessary. Because patients have to stay longer when an infection won't cave, since it's multi-resistant. And you're paying for it. Yet my Swedish socialist government comments on the increase by downplaying the problem and saying, yeah, it did heavily increase during the refugee crisis in 2015, but this increase is primarily because refugees sought healthcare and got tested. Well, great! It's because of refugees then! I don't exactly feel safe from the fact that the specific people who could be bothered to do it felt like going to the hospital that day, perhaps because their symptoms got too much to deal with. But since I'm living in Sweden, I have to put up with the fact that they decided to go with hope for the best as their official government policy. And the whole thing is so stupid. Of course, bacteria and disease spread through migration. Why didn't you have a better policy in place decades ago? Why does my government think that going to the doctor is offensive? How stupid do they assume that most immigrants are if you think that this would even be an issue? It's funny when people's charity actually reveals their contempt. And the signal that sends to citizens is shut up, because non-citizens matter more than you. Essentially, they're doing away with the concept of a citizenship, and in the long run, the nation-state itself. They know Swedes are peaceful suckers that will pay their taxes anyway, and they know it's not very Swedish to complain, so they'll just spit on them, because it's only really gonna lead to an angry email at best. Swedes are so culturally autistic, they don't even do demonstrations. So don't expect a Yellow West situation here just yet. But do remember, when you finally drive an autist far enough, he's not gonna be void of emotion and hyper-rational much longer. Never underestimate the chaos factor of retard strength. In 2017, the department released new numbers, and state media wrote an article saying, record increase of infections by resistant bacteria. It is now established in Sweden. Doctor says they're seeing many more cases since immigrant countries don't have the same strict use of antibiotics or the kind of control that we got in Sweden. So, culture? Gotland County got it worse. They only accepted 1,000 asylum seekers, yet their MRSA numbers doubled that year. Half the cases were immigrants, but the doctor also points out that Gotland's population increases tenfold during the summer, since it's a popular travel destination. So a lot of cases are discovered amongst tourists, which bumps up the statistics since they're received in Gotland but actually live somewhere else. Now I know he's trying to be nuanced, but it really just sounds like he's saying that 1,000 refugees is as toxic as a tenfold expansion of Swedes. It should be noted that Swedes pick up MRSA as well when they travel to certain countries, but it's quite remarkable how overrepresented migrants are with various bacteria and disease. It's clear enough that a more general health vetting system should be common sense, yet we just don't have that. Now here's a few facts that might paint a picture. The majority of Sweden's lands is uninhabited. It might not feel like it to us Swedes personally, but we're living very dense. 10 million people occupying only 30% of the country, and less than 3% is big cities. 85% of Sweden's population live in various cities, where public transit is part of day-to-day life, so buses and trains are extremely common. Now, you wanna know what makes diseases turn into epidemics? Human movement, since it's human contact. Cholera was able to spread that way from small isolated cities to large towns, infecting hundreds and thousands more, making it an epidemic in the Midwest of America. Quote, this was a time when cholera's infectiousness was denied by accepted authorities. Huh. Where have I heard that before? In general, cholera was blamed on miasmas, filthy living conditions, especially the poor blacks, and the Irish. The religion of the Irish immigrants was especially troublesome. Some blamed the sinful behavior of whole population groups and the just wrath of an angry God. Oh, Seamus. What have you done, me boy? Couldn't you wipe the shite off your ass? Oh, may God have mercy on you, lad. The Black Plague was brought to West Norway in 1349 via ship, filled with diseased rat and fleas from England. What's interesting is that even though rats brought it on board and infected the city of Bergen, human migration is credited with infecting the rest of the country. Quote, the rats cannot have played a part except in the initial phase. End of quote. And thus it ended with upwards 50% of Norway's population simply being wiped out. Just because Western healthcare has advanced since then doesn't mean we're immune to just about anything and can cure everything. Why, that would be terribly ethnocentric of us. Now, wouldn't it? Remember the credo of multiculturalism, the chant of diversity. Not every country looks the same because not every country has the same culture, meaning they have evolved into different directions or at different paces. That might explain why a bunch of doctors put together a study urging EU countries to revise their health policies on migrants. What's annoying is that this is historical knowledge that should have been taught in school, but apparently history is racist now. This is still a great nuanced article though, and I really think you should read it. It's about all those studies that show how pregnant women become more wary of foreigners. It has to do with biology as well as history. Look at what's happening in Sweden right now, and the past becomes surprisingly relevant. When European settlers reached America, they promptly infected Native Americans with measles, whooping cough, smallpox, and a number of other diseases to which they had no immunity. Today we might experience this when we travel to new glamorous locations and spend many unglamorous evenings perched on a toilet with traveler's diarrhea. Or the plague, you know, India had it in the 90s and it's still around today, so that's a thing. I guess perhaps it is privileged to live in a country where that's not commonplace. But at the same time, maybe we shouldn't fool ourselves that we're more privileged than we really are. It's not like having to take a creamy shit is the worst thing that can happen when you travel to a different country. So I find it kind of funny that the Atlantic chose to continue with this conclusion. In centuries past, it may have been healthy to tread carefully around foreigners. Not only might outsiders carry dangerous germs, they might also not be familiar with the kind of local customs, food preparation laws, or sexual practices that conferred some measure of protection against communicable diseases. Why are you speaking in past tense? What you said makes perfect sense even today, and it's not even a freaking race issue. If you're gonna chant about diversity all the time, at least be intellectually honest enough to admit that all countries do not look the same because of diversity, because of their cultures, for better or worse. And it's because of this that the Sweden Democrats called for mandatory health checkups of refugees. Which really isn't the definition of racism, because these evil white men are literally trying to ensure that everyone has better health, including brown people. This is Sweden's biggest paper, and the angle they chose was, but the spread of tuberculosis hasn't increased in Sweden, so what's your point with this political proposal? To which the nationalist leader replied with the painfully obvious, an increase is exactly what we're risking when we welcome people here who have that disease. So it's about preventing problems before they arise, which really has been a tradition with the Sweden Democrats' rhetoric over the years. This absurd racism phobia that you're seeing here by our Swedish media is a norm for us living here. So this isn't the first time political correctness has stood in the way of political responsibility. Swedish politicians don't want to prevent problems before they happen. Partly because they would be out of a job, and partly because it's more important to be accepted by left-wing media who hates them anyway. Another highly absurd question that the prostitutes asked was, what kind of signals does it send to those who migrate to Sweden? Oh my god, yeah, that's like a really good question. What if they get like offended and explode? Oh my god, what if they interpret it as like prejudice or racism? That would be horrible. Because then they might get offended and explode. We can't.
What if someone would think of Sweden as a
Sweden?
racist country?
Everyone knows that moderate prejudice is way worse than Ebola. You can't like compare death and disease to words and thoughts in people's heads. Racism has killed way more people than Ebola. Clearly, thought crime is a much bigger issue in the Soviet European Union than health epidemics killing people. Totally the right priorities our leaders got there. Sweden is seriously at the level where you'd rather catch a serious disease than risk offending unreasonable people. All this talk about white privilege gave Swedes so much white guilt that they now think they're combating structural racism by killing themselves, more or less. So when they're lying in a hospital bed dying, they can go, oh, it's
Oh, at least now I face the same biological challenge as my black neighbor. My black neighbor. Now that my body's being colonized by disease, I can finally feel some karma over what someone else's ancestors did to Africa. Not sure why I feel white guilt over the Arabs though, since Muslims enslaved more Europeans than the other way around.
Fucking all Jigaboo's say It's truly a case of tragic comedy, how the left basically want to let black people die because they're afraid of offending them. Do you think it's comfortable to have Ebola? You think it's comfortable with measles, cholera, malaria, whatever they have down there? You think migrants wanna bleed out in a hospital bed somewhere? You don't think their quality of life would change for the better if they got offended more often than went to see a doctor? If Sweden just made it mandatory and explained why, because that kind of information isn't public knowledge in their home countries, I'm sure in time that people would just kind of get over it. It's not exactly something that you can dwell on forever, and new information always takes a while to get used to. Look, you people keep calling me racist, and yet I'm sitting here forced to explain to you that Africans and Arabs are capable of reason. Why do I have to say that in Sweden 2019? It is clear to me that none of you know anything about the cultures you want to import, because if you did, you would have had a responsible strategy and you would have had it planned out way ahead. Instead, you just decided diversity sounds nice and threw all common sense out the window. Because private banks and big corporations benefit from the import of a new underclass. The upper class benefits the most from multiculturalism because they get to reap the rewards of population increase without having to live among. So there are financial incentives here, but also ideological ones. Cultural relativism and moral relativism. I advise you to research those schools of thoughts, because that really is the underlying mind virus that has hijacked Western brains and made us retarded. And it makes sense that moral relativism would result in a PC mentality, because if you don't believe in objective truth, you also don't believe in a clear and solid right and wrong. In doing so, you've also given up the larger debate that mankind has indirectly through politics and pop culture on what the best ideas are to live by. And that's when we end up with these absurd displays of contempt masked as well-meaning protection. Let them die because it's their culture. And since all cultures are equal, white people can give up their health privileges so non-privileged minorities can live more healthy in Sweden. Except it's not their culture, and that kind of leftist white guilt bullshit is exactly what makes people racist. Because when you conflate every bad behavior with their culture, and then say that we should respect their culture, you're basically saying that we should respect stupidity. And normal people, common people, the average citizen, is just not gonna do that. They might not think of it consciously in those terms, but that is the process of multiculturalism and the political correctness which fuels it. Which is how people get radicalized. They didn't care about skin color before, but you kept pressuring them about what cis scum they are and pushing them deeper and deeper into a corner, and sooner or later they're just gonna be fed up with it. Just think of it like this. Would you do it to your own kid? If your 30-year-old kid refused to shake hands with women, and only women, would you respect his principles? Or would you make him realize that he's a misogynist? If your kid was living off welfare checks for 6 years and then decided to have 2 children, in addition to the 7 he already has, would you respect his lifestyle? Or would you tell him he's a cock goblin? If your kid believed that he could cure his AIDS by banging a newborn baby, would you respect his identity? Or would you explain why he's failed as a creature? Wanting to leave people in shitty positions because of their ethnicity isn't really a nice thing to do. It's not exactly cool, and your buzzwords don't work on me. I can tell you leftards aren't humanitarian because I look at people's behavior, not their words. It's pretty easy to figure out who's full of shit that way. Here's a mind exercise that, feel free to do this one with other people. Make a list of the shitty cultural traditions that you find across the world, and then pretend that your friend starts taking after that behavior. Your best friend. An individual that you wish well and would want to give the best advice in times of need. Are you saying it would be morally correct to not criticize them? That is an ideology of apathy. And the only thing it takes for true evil forces to win is for good people to do nothing. When you claim that everything is relative, you also never really have to take a stand. You can just ignore everything that's uncomfortable and just maintain your good reputation and act like you're not noticing an epidemic of female genital mutilation or the ethnic overrepresentation in sex crime while you're sipping away at Starbucks. The idea that all cultures are equal is philosophical infancy. If that were true, LGBT individuals wouldn't be seeking asylum in Europe. A culture is more or less just a collection of ideas, and nobody can honestly argue that all ideas are equally good. Yet multiculturalism is essentially the idea that since all cultures are equal, they can live side by side in harmony. At least that's the theory part of the practice. And where did that get us? This wild experiment that's never been done before. At the end of the day, political correctness is a kind of stupidity that erodes. The reason we do health checkups and get shots is for everyone's safety. So why are you allowing Africans and Arabs to become the scapegoats if something were to go bad? Look at the elite. Look at their actions and not their words. The globalist establishment and their NPCs don't care about immigrants. They think a responsible public health policy is racism. And it's so crazy to think that they put higher standards on citizens traveling abroad, taking a vacation, than unknown non-citizens who decide to move to their country. You wouldn't treat your house like that. You wouldn't treat your family like that. And since the nation is an extension of the family, we shouldn't treat people like that.